Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this afternoon for this Bright Blue event in partnership with Energy Ombudsman. And the title is Restoring Trust and Confidence Between Businesses and Consumers in Essential Markets. So if you're in the wrong room, you can leave now. The event is being live streamed. So hello to those people wherever you are, in the Maldives or Mauritius or somewhere very nice. And for those of you who don't know Bright Blue, we're an independent think tank for liberal conservatism. We see our mission as defending and improving liberal society. We work across four main areas: social policy, education policy, energy and environment policy, and education policy. Did I say education policy? Or employment policy? Four there, hopefully. I'm Ryan Shorthouse. I'm the exec chair. Just to say, please do use the hashtag #BrightBlue if you want to amplify the messages that are coming from this event to a wider audience. And our Twitter handle is @WeAreBrightBlue, and you can also use the Twitter handle @Energy Ombudsman. So, obviously, largely caused by the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion in Ukraine, energy prices spiked. And that has obviously led to higher prices and perhaps some tension between consumers and energy companies. But it's not just in energy, which is an essential market, but other essential markets, for example, like banking and telecoms, where perhaps the relationship between consumers and producers needs to be improved and strengthened. And there's obviously a role for regulators in doing so. So the sort of questions that we want this very good panel to explore is, what's the impact of the rising cost of living on that trust between consumers and producers? And are soaring profits for energy companies and banks impacting the way consumers view companies in these markets? Which companies have high levels of consumer trust and which have low levels of consumer trust, and why? Why is that? What can we learn from that? And how important is trust really to making the market work effectively for individuals and businesses generally? And what's the role of public policy in all of this in terms of strengthening trust? If trust is important, how do we make public policy improve it? So the panel that we've got, and each will speak for 5 minutes, and then we're going to take questions from the floor. We have Dr. Luke Evans, MP, to my near left, who's the PPS to the Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero, who's just spoken this morning.
Well, not me, but
but Claire did. Yes, the Secretary of State.
She did.
And then next to him is Guy Newey, who is the Chief Executive of Energy Systems Catapult and previously a Special Advisor in the government. We have to his left Daisy Powell-Chandler, who's the Head of Energy and Environment at Public First, and also a previous advisor for the Conservatives. And then to my near right, we have Melissa Lawford, who is the economics correspondent of the Daily Telegraph. To her right is Laura Sands, OBE, who is the former chair of the UK government's Energy Digitalisation Task Force and a former MP in the coalition period. And then to her right is Ed Dodman, who is the Business Unit Director and Chief Ombudsman at Energy Ombudsman. So I'm going to ask Luke to kick us off.
Well, thank you very much for having me here. And I think the presupposition in the question is restoring trust, well, whether we think trust has been lost in the first place. And I think it has been dented. But if we start really quite wide scope, what is going on and why does it matter? Many of you here have exhibited the quintessential British trait of queuing up for your food. We as Brits have that inherently built in us to be able to queue. It's not where you necessarily get in that queue, but it's the fairness around who jumps in front, why you're there, when you got there, and how that plays out. And that all comes down to fair play. And you only have to look at many cultural examples, from Maradona's handball to what's going on in the Ashes most recently with one of the players being stumped out, what happened at number 10 over the pandemic, Phil and Holly when it came to seeing the Queen at the funeral. All of these really play at a sense of fair play. And that's inherent in the way Brits approach the problems. And I think that's really, really important, because what I see from what's happened in the pandemic in my MP inbox is people very stressed and looking for answers from the pandemic. The government had to step in and put its arms around people, which it did with the likes of the furlough scheme. But what we've created is this need that it's always someone else's responsibility to sort this out. And I saw this as a doctor. A patient would come to you and have diabetes and want you to give them the medication to sort it out. But there's a sense of responsibility of what you can do to help yourself. So how do we untangle this? And I thought I'd just give you a few examples of what I see in my inbox of where we've got when it comes to dealing with some of these issues. So, for example, the Competitions and Markets Authorities as a regulator, there's been issues around petrol prices. The number of constituents who come to me saying, I see petrol prices varied across within 5 miles that are 10p different. And of course they go up very high but come down very slowly. Is this really fair? What's going on here? Supermarket prices. We've most recently seen that. The CMA had to step in to see, is there fair competition going on here? A consultation open at the moment on veterinarian prices, because we know they've skyrocketed. What about Ofcom? Well, we've had the talk about social tariffs. Where do they cut in? Are they accessible? But at the moment, if you look at your mobile phone contract, when you went to sign it up, it was CPI or RPI plus 3.9%. That's 14-15% increase in your mobile phone bill overnight. And is that fair? You then jump into the likes of Ofgem, Ofwat, the FCA. All these regulators have a really big part to play in what's going on. The question is, do the public believe them, and do they have the teeth to deal with it? And that's the key question, because part of most of these regulators will have transparency at their core. But if you stopped a man or woman in the street and asked them, what does Ofgem do? What does Ofwat do? I'd be surprised if they even have heard of them, let alone what they do or their latest regimes were. And this is quite difficult for the government, because on the one hand, the government has an independent regulator to do exactly that, be independent, but the other hand takes it in the neck for not getting it right. And this perception is there that when profits are going up in the energy companies, in the banks, that actually the government should step in and do something. It's very interesting though when you ask people, how much, does anyone know how much the energy companies are being taxed on their profits at the moment? 75%. Now, when you say that to the public, they go, God, really? What? It doesn't seem like that. So there's a disconnect. So I think this panel has a real tough job to try and work out how we join that disconnect, because the other only option that's being put across from the left is to actually nationalise and legislate much tougher on this basis. But if we want these free markets to really work, we have to have the tough regulators that people trust in and believe it. Well, but in some of these areas, you're absolutely right, which is why the likes of social tariffs should come in.
You've given them a monopoly, and they're just stopping their.
Well, I'm sure this is what we'll get into as well, because you've seen with the likes of the energy market, young players who tried to get in, to broker into this, actually got squeezed out, and everyone else is footing the bills to try and support them to make sure that you can pass that on. But this is exactly the point. People believe, you're a classic example of why people don't believe it works. And that is the fundamental problem that we're facing, that's been exasperated during the pandemic.
Great. Thank you, Luke. And Misha, can I just ask you to bring a jug of water, because suddenly I've got a dry throat. So I'd be grateful if you could bring that up for all of the speakers as well. Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, Melissa, over to you.
Thank you. I wanted to take a look first at to what extent we can definitively say the cost of living crisis has triggered a slump in consumer trust, and the numbers are quite definitive. YouGov has these wonderful trackers that polls the public on what they think about certain sectors, and we can see very clearly, during the height of the pandemic, about half of consumers thought supermarkets were great, and this year that had slumped to 28%. So it nearly halved, and in utilities it's just massively dramatic, gone from less than 10% of people in February 21 thought had an unfavourable view of utility companies, and now that's half, or it was half last summer. But I think one of the big questions is, why does that matter for businesses? Because actually, If you look at some of the sectors that have the worst consumer trust, for example, social media, very low consumer trust, incredibly high use. And it's the same with utilities companies. They've seen a big drop in consumer trust, but actually that's a sector that has a lot of brand inertia. People are very, very loyal, and it takes quite a lot for them to move. It's the same with banks. Whereas the supermarkets that typically have quite high trust, they really bear the brunt of people shopping around. People are very, very quick to change their suppliers, change their brands, and so I think there is a question of what is actually the problem for brands if people don't trust them. The first one is that there is evidence of switching. Think Strategy, which is a market research group, did a survey, and although they found that more than half of people said that they were going to stick with their energy supplier, 30% of them were shopping around, and 73% of them said that was because they wanted a better price. So there is evidence it is starting to erode, where people are putting their feet. But there is this thing, they call it the say-do gap, where people might complain about something, and they might say they care a lot about sustainability, but also changing is a total faff, especially when it's something like your bank account, and they tend not to do it. That's really clear, particularly on ethical issues. So, Think Strategy has this figure that 70% of consumers say they care about ethics, and 16% say it actually influences their decisions. And Think Strategy thinks it's an even smaller proportion that actually will actually do something. But there is this growing sense of a future problem. Ignore the say-do gap at your peril. And I think that the cost of living crisis, it has been very much a catalyst, because it's not just about price. If you want to fix an issue of consumer trust, you can't suddenly just make your prices cheaper and people will then have a very rosy view of you. I think that it catalyzed this scrutiny, and then people are looking at bigger issues, and those, what people have discovered when they've started looking at your business practices or the way you treat your employees, that can't just be washed away by price. And there are 4 key areas that market researchers have found that consumers really care about. The first one is doing right by your customer, and that is a question of price. But the other 3, and these are quite equal in how people are scrutinizing businesses, they also care a lot about whether or not they're an ethical employer. Are you paying your employees enough, and are you treating them well? They care a lot about whether or not businesses are paying their taxes. And they also care, which I think is quite interesting, about whether or not people are paying their suppliers fairly, about their supply chains. And so these are things that people are thinking about. And there's also this question of sustainability. And I think here the numbers show really why this is why trust does matter for businesses, is because these are your future consumers, and maybe people aren't going to have that much brand fluidity now, but where are young people going to take their business in a few years' time, or where are people going to make their decisions when, I don't know, they move house and they are going to get a new energy supplier? And I think sustainability really exemplifies this, because of those 30% of people who were shopping around looking for a new energy and new energy supplier, 73% we're doing that because of price. But amongst younger people, those in their 20s and 30s, it was only 36% who were doing that because of price. 31% were doing it because of sustainability reasons. And that is something that is coming through much more with the younger generation. Is something I think a lot more brands need to be conscious of communicating. But communication is then the next problem, because people actually just don't really trust adverts, and they don't believe things when brands tell them that they're doing something. And I think, to be honest, all of this comes down to brands need to do 2 things to regain consumer trust. I think they need to do the things that they are saying that they're doing. And the second thing is, I think they need to offer choice. And I think a lot of that is what it comes down to, because, that question of brand inertia and people not moving, I think that actually feeds a challenge to consumer trust. If people feel trapped in a brand or with a company, I think they're less likely to like them, and I think that becomes a building problem for that brand going forwards.
Great, thank you very much, Melissa. Very thoughtful stuff. If you're standing up and you want to come and sit down, there are some seats at the front, so please use this opportunity to come forward if you want to. Just a question that I had for both of you, actually, both speakers who have spoke thus far, is around privatisation across different essential industries, and whether in net terms, Luke, you think that has been good across all industries. And then Melissa, whether you have access to this, but in terms of whether the public view privatisation across different essential industries as in net terms a positive thing.
Broadly, I think it is. I mean, I have the benefit, I guess, of coming from the NHS, which is very much public run, to then step into other areas and look at that from a government point of view and see what the private sector does. Now, both have their challenges for different reasons. I think it is, but it's the functioning within the market that makes the difference to make sure there is fair competition. And you're held, it comes back to this fair play of, are you held to the fair standards? If you don't have a choice and there's only 4 different banks at the time, then there's no incentive for them to be able to push their improvement for their customer service. The more disruptors you get in, the likes of Chase, the likes of Monzo, that give people choice. Open banking now, so where you can look across all your different accounts and pull them together. Allow people to make it easy to swap within 7 days with a switch guarantee. These things suddenly allow people to be able to make a choice. The problem is, almost, you're given too much choice, and that creates another problem on the other side. So I think it's imperative to make sure that the market functions well by having more choice in there. And I think our energy market is a good example where you've tried to do that, but it's failed because people haven't been able to get enough companies who are trying to get people signed up by doing cheap rates. An energy crisis comes along and then puts out the likes of OVO Energy, which was based in my constituency, leaving consumers really high and dry, and the rest of it carrying a huge amount of, the consumers carrying a lot of the cost. So the government and the CMA have to look at this very carefully. What the answer is, I'm not sure is the right answer. I don't have that for you yet, but actually you need the data and facts to try and look at that and pull it apart. But we see this as well. I found it really interesting, Melissa, your point about brands need to do this, about do what you say and choice. I felt that was almost aimed at a political conference as well, that are both political parties, that anyone's in there, they need to do what they say and provide that choice of what they're going to do, and a stark choice. Because unless we do that, it becomes very difficult and people get disenfranchised, which is what you're seeing. Politics, energy, banking, the NHS, people don't trust the information they're told anymore, which is a very scary place for a society to be in.
Melissa?
Does the public think companies would be better privatised or nationalised? I think, if I'm very honest, I think at the end of the day, I don't think people care whether it's privatised or nationalised if it is being managed well. If they think they are getting good value and it is being efficiently run, I think that is the number one thing. So I think that is then a question of, do they think things will be better run if it's privatised or better run if it's nationalised? And that might depend quite a lot on which side of the political spectrum you sit. But I don't know. I think it ties back to what Luke was saying about choice. And, we've got the water companies all releasing their 5-year business plans today, and I haven't looked at them yet, but everyone was expecting people to announce quite significant bills rises. And the thing with that is people don't have a choice. I mean, if it's a water company in your area, what are you going to do? You've got to pay it. And if people can see exactly where that money is going and what effect it's going to have if it is going to reduce pollution in the rivers, I think people can find that more palatable than if there is less explanation. So perhaps that's an example of where transparency can do something to compensate for a lack of choice.
Great, thank you. So it's now to Laura. I apologise because you were higher up than Melissa in the running order, so I've kept you waiting.
No. I've been learning a lot from Melissa, so it's been very useful. Thank you.
Over to you.
Well, my very first, and actually the only time I've really worked for somebody else, was working for Which. So I come with a sort of strong consumer dimension and feel very strongly about consumer protection, the environment in which consumers make choices. And I would say that probably for the last 30 years, consumers have been more or less ignored by public policy and very much ignored by, in some ways, new regulatory regimes. We've got a fundamental issue with some of our utility sectors, and absolutely, totally reflect what the last two speakers were talking about. Certainly in energy, there is a lack of trust. There is no differentiation. So you talk about whether these are nationalised or privatised. They're so regulated that actually what you have is a choice between different coloured logos, right? Which is the prettiest logo? Because the price is the same, the package is the same, the proposition is the same. And as we start to move into a new world where actually a lot of new business models that I'm sure Guy will talk about will come through, we really do need to understand that consumer regulation and consumer protection must be at the heart of the next government, whatever it is, because fundamentally the world has changed dramatically. And I just want to cover a couple of the dynamics that are changing. So AI and digital propositions. This is something that our current regime just doesn't understand. It doesn't understand the conflation of different businesses. So I might want to buy a home services product, which would include broadband, maybe financial services that unlocks my heat pump, and then also my energy. Do you know how many ombudsman, great, Martin here, ombudsman and regulatory regimes I would have to go through? I would have to go through 6 different regulatory regimes. How am I going to navigate that? Right? And then what will happen is everyone will say, whoa, it's not my fault, is it? Oh, yeah, no, it's the other guy, it's the financial services, or it's the heat pump manufacturer. This has to be understood. We need to build both regulation, consumer protection around how I consume, not how businesses are organised. And the problem is what we've got is a very fragmented, very siloed set of consumer protections and consumer regimes, none of which, every time I as a customer have to navigate a new proposition or understand a new regime. So we need to start to make this very, very much more consumer-centric. And as I say, there are going to be quite a lot of changes in terms of how utilities, but other products are going to be sold to me. And I need something that helps me rather than serves the companies. So what is the change that might be needed? Firstly, I think we need to really look at the digital divide. And I would say that it's almost, if not a human right, to be connected, to have digital access. If you think that if you're a consumer and you're not you don't have broadband, you don't have digital access, you will be paying between 15 and 20% more for all your products and services. So this is a big cost of living issue. Secondly, we do need to look at vulnerability. It is a very blunt tool. It's not really understood, and there are lots more growing vulnerabilities, but also reducing vulnerabilities. It's a very old-fashioned system. It needs to be reviewed. I do a lot of work with Ofgem and love them greatly. They're economic regulators, and then they've got this thing called consumer regulation, a bit tagged on. This is not actually a system that works, and they cannot really understand and predict the new business models that are coming through. There is a water council for consumers, right? We don't have the same in energy. There's the Australian Energy Consumers Organisation. These are things that need to be put in place to actually give customers a voice. But I have a dream. And the dream goes further. And that is that, and this actually, strange enough, was something that I talked a lot and was very much well received by Liz Truss. And that is that what we do is we create an economic regulator for essential services, and that means water, telco, energy. And actually they all have issues, the same issues around cost of capital, around equity return, all of these very, very sort of deep financial issues, and bring them together. And then we have an essential consumer regulator who actually understands the blending of these products and services on my behalf and can actually have a very strong voice into that economic regulator saying, is this delivering for customers? Have you got the right protections in place? And are you as an economic regulator really delivering not just cost, but value? And I think if you look at water in particular, we have invested a huge amount in trying to reduce cost. And what we haven't really done is delivered value, as you can see.
Great. Thank you very much, Laura. Surprised that you're a Trusside.
You heard it first.
That is quite...
That's a step too far. Right, Guy.
I'll recover from that one day.
Thanks, right. So a few years ago, I was working for OVO Energy before I was in government. I've just got to correct Luke as well, because he said that OVO gone bust. Unless they have this morning.
No.
I think you're thinking about Bulb, or one of the many others. Over probably 40 odd companies have gone bust over the last few years. So I was working at OVO Energy, and there was competition and markets inquiry into, is the energy market working properly? Are they ripping off consumers? Yada yada. All the topics we're talking about today. And buried amongst all the mountain of material that came out from that, there was a great anonymous quote from one of the then Big Six. OVO is now part of the Big Six, and this world changes. Was what we're trying to do is to keep our customers asleep. Basically, they didn't want to have any engagement with them at all. Now, that is a perfectly sensible commercial strategy in lots of ways. You know, one of your big costs is your consumers phoning up in your time, and if they're satisfied, they don't phone you up all the time. But if you think about the challenge that we're going to have to do in decarbonisation of the economy, you cannot think like that. Because really the challenge is, how do we make it really easy for people, easy and desirable for people to decarbonise their homes? That's the biggest challenge we're facing. We've made massive progress on decarbonising the electricity sector. You know, coal is basically off the system. We've increased renewables about 35% of the power sector over the last 13 years. But from a consumer point of view, it doesn't really make that much difference. Turn on the light comes on. The consumer experience is the same. But when you're talking about transport, you're talking about heating, that's a really big challenge, which trust is going to be absolutely essential. And buildings really is the hardest thing. We've got 27 million homes, 4 million non-domestic buildings, and we've all got to make them low carbon. But if you don't start with the idea that you're going to make things better for consumers, that's actually your target, you've got no chance. And actually, consumers will be quite relaxed about profits in the energy sector if they thought that their experience would be better. Mm-hmm. And right now, their experience on heating in particular is not great. Mold, damp, drafts, overheating, underheating, all of these challenges need to be worked through. Lots of the companies we work with, the Catapult, and those of you who don't know us, we're an innovation centre. There's a great company called Evergreen, which are about 500 yards that way. And they've got a great control device that works with heating systems, which basically can turn your heating on earlier or slightly later. Your consumer experience is exactly the same. You don't feel any differently. But it will work with the system, allow the system to be more efficient and make the best out of it. There are companies like Geo, who are based down in Cambridge, who are coming up pretty soon with a smart device which is going to help control all the devices in your home. You program what you want, and then it optimizes across that. We're working on something called Warm Home Prescription, where actually for vulnerable people in particular, whose health conditions are exacerbated by a cold home, so emphysema, COPD, etc. Can you actually prescribe people to have a warm home? Can you get them on the journey? And that is all about using people who are trusted, in this case the NHS, to help identify people who could benefit from some of the things that energy companies have been trying to push into people's homes, but because they're low trust organisations actually struggled with. So, policy recommendations. One, think really hard about what the outcomes are that are going to need. Often when people have heating systems installed, they've no idea whether they're working well. That's the same with gas boilers as it will be with heat pumps, and with heat pumps probably more important. So focus really hard on that outcome so that people actually build trust, because that's one of the things that's actually going to build trust. I had this energy efficiency measure installed. It has actually helped reduce my bills, rather than it all feels a bit mythical at the moment. Encourage the innovation. That's all about getting the incentives right. Right now, if you get a heat pump installed, you are going to be, even if you get it done properly, you're probably going to end up paying more for it than if you had a gas boiler. That is a real massive disincentive to innovation. So getting that balance right is absolutely essential. And then think, as Laura said, think about protecting the most vulnerable in society. So that is about some protection. The price cap is a pretty crude tool to do that, but thinking about digital exclusion, thinking about health effects, etc. That would be my building blocks for building trust.
So if not the energy price cap, what if that's a crude way of doing it? What's a better way of doing it?
Well, so we've been through an absolutely extraordinary couple of years where, pretty much everyone needed some kind of protection, and we were lucky enough to live in a country that could afford to help out. I think you take a broad but pretty well targeted view of where the vulnerable consumers are, and you've got some kind of protection around the social tariff, etc. That's probably, I would guess, kind of 4.5 million in a kind of when you get back to normal years. And then you'd also be using, as we said, kind of thinking about other means for getting that help to the people who need it most. So using the health service, targeted, etc. The key thing is taking advantage of the opportunity of digitalisation and data of energy to actually help you work out people who are really struggling with their energy bills very, very quickly. Because we kind of have these crude measures for the people who get support at the moment. People are over a particular age or on particular benefits, etc. Whereas if the energy companies really understood their consumers in the way that other sectors do, you'd actually say that person is showing signs of real trouble. You could actually have a decent conversation with them.
Great, thank you. So Daisy, you're immersed in all of public polling and attitudes. So where are the public on this?
Well, I'm actually going to take off my energy and environment hat. I'm also head of reputation, and when we look at what the public thinks about companies, you need to think about what is trust. Trust usually breaks down into two things. Do I believe you will do the job that I asked you to do? Do I believe you're competent? That's, do you add value? And then there is a values component. Do I believe you mean well? Do I believe you are good people with good intentions? And the way in which our essential markets has moved recently means that we've undermined both elements of that. So essentially the manner in which we've built regulation telegraphs that we believe that none of these companies have good values. We do not believe they are in it for good. But the way in which we have then regulated prevents them in many cases from offering good value. So many of the guardrails that we've put around energy, for example, can track down the number of viable business models, and the way in which we have helped people with essential help during the energy price crisis means that essentially there is now no price difference between most companies, and the way in which their margins have been squeezed. And I know that sounds laughable given some of the profit announcements, but a lot of the profit announcements you're hearing for energy companies are for companies that don't provide energy to consumers. It's about the work they're doing on a global stage, buying and selling energy. So consumer energy companies are actually not very profitable businesses for the most part. And part of that is because of the way we have squeezed their margins, and that means that what gets cut? Customer service. So actually, it's not very hard to switch energy company, but why would you bother at the moment? You're going to pay the same amount, and you're still going to get treated really badly by a lot of them. And that's not entirely the energy company's fault. To defend them, the system has created that structure. And there's another problem here, which several speakers have alluded to, which is this problem of how on earth we get help to people. And what we have also asked a lot of our essential services companies to do is act as an extension of the welfare state, which has undermined trust further, because we're expecting them to either take some money off some of their consumers and hand that to others. That's pretty fraught. Or we're expecting them to hand out government money through their own bills. Now, again, some of those service providers have been their own worst enemies here because they were so worried about the amount of debt they were carrying on consumer bills that they wanted this to be run through them so that they could recover as much money as possible for commercial reasons. But some of that was the government saying, we don't understand these consumers well enough in order to be able to give them this help ourselves. So I think there's a few different policy recommendations to come out of this. One is that when we're creating regulatory regimes, we have to make sure that the guardrails we're adding don't actually prevent companies from offering the value or the values that we hope they will provide. Competition, which many of the policies put in over the last few years have set as an end that they are aiming for, is not an end in itself. It's a means to providing good customer service and great value. And that's what regulation should be about. But we also need the government to have a more nuanced understanding of households so that it can better provide help to those who need it. As a first start, we need to stop talking about different kinds of poverty. It's not very helpful to talk about fuel poverty or mobility poverty or poverty, or period poverty rather. It's poverty, and we need to have a better picture of that by understanding households as well as individuals. So another policy recommendation from me would be to create a better digital spine within government so that we can understand what poverty looks like on a household level, because that is where nearly all of the essential services we're talking about today exist, is at household level, not at individual level. And to understand fuel poverty, for example, if you buy into the concept, you need to understand not only the energy bill, which is a household expense, but also how drafty that house is. And you can't do that by looking at an individual tax return.
Great, thank you, Daisy. And I'm enjoying all of these policy suggestions. That's very good. So Ed, over to you.
Thanks, Ryan. Like Luke was saying, the average person in the street probably doesn't know who Ofgem is. I think I should assume the same for the Energy Ombudsman. So just very briefly, with the Energy Ombudsman, we are part of the Trust Alliance group, and our job is to resolve complaints between consumers and suppliers, and then to try and use that insight to build trust in the energy sector and the other sectors that we work in. We're interested in trust for two reasons. One, both have been touched on by the panel so far. One is it's a really interesting measure of how well markets are working for consumers in their eyes. And I think that's really important in both essential markets, but also, as we've been hearing, markets where we've intervened through regulation or protection. It's really important that we ask people how well they feel they're working for them. So it's an outcome, but it's also really importantly an enabler. So people will make really different choices depending on, Guy touched on this, depending on how much they trust the people and the organisations they're working with. And I think if we think about the magnitude of choices that we're going to be asking people to make in the energy sector, heating, transport, insulation, trust becomes really important, and trust has the potential to be both a brake or an accelerator for those changes depending on how well we do it. What's the situation in energy? It's not a well-trusted sector. Whether it's bottom or second to bottom depends, quite frankly, which day of the week you're asking people. It might be second to bottom with the water announcement Melissa's just mentioned earlier today. But you know, perhaps it's not surprising. It's been an incredible few years in energy. We've lost 30 to 40 suppliers, as Guy said. Bills doubled in the space of 12 months. They're still 50% higher than they were 12, 18 months ago. And of course, we've got this narrative around record profits and profits that perhaps people on the surface don't feel are well earned. I think in that context, it's perhaps not surprising where we are with trust. And we're seeing that too. So we've seen the number of people coming to us double in the past 2 years. So we now, serve over 100,000 consumers a year who are coming to us with unresolved complaints. And those are people who want to know that they're being treated fairly. And for various reasons, they don't feel that at the moment. Some of it's the complexity of the sector and the service they've got. Some of it is the performance of suppliers. So at the moment, we've kind of got a market which could be defined as high carbon and low trust. And I think what we need to do is think about how we flip that. And we'd absolutely argue that you can't have one without the other. Won't chuck in too much more policy, Ryan, because I think we've had quite a lot of that, but just a couple of areas I think we need to think about when we're trying to overcome this challenge. One is absolutely recognising that the market is different. This is just to elaborate on what Guy said. In the historic energy market, gas and electricity coming into your home, contact from consumers was seen as bad. It was a cost. Why would consumers need to contact you? If they did, it was because there was a problem. Actually, we need to think about how we flip that on its head and now think about how every contact we have with consumers is actually an opportunity to engage them, and obviously suppliers have a big role to play there. And then finally, the regulatory policy, legal framework, again, touching on what Laura said, needs to focus on consumer outcomes rather than market mechanisms. So a focus more on service than switching, maybe more on trust than transfers, and thinking about the outcomes of real people rather than just how the market looks from a policy perspective.
Great, thank you, Ed. Very, very interesting. Interesting what you said around the doubling of people coming to you over the last few years. And I'm interested in whether that's a kind of sign of failure in the wider energy market or a sign of success, which is you're more known and it's easier to kind of access the services that you offer. What's your view on that?
I think it's a bit of both. We've seen increases across all types of complaints, so it's not like there's a particular reason people are coming to us more than ever. I think it was great that during the crisis people were more informed about their options and where they could go to for help. We're a not-for-profit, I should say, so we're not interested in the commercials of more people coming to us. It's great if we're more accessible, but at the same time we'd much rather help suppliers fix the problems before they come to us. So I think a little bit of both. We saw suppliers struggling. It was a very difficult period, but also energy was in the news every day. And I think that was we were doing more press and more public stuff than ever, and it was great to be able to tell people how they could get that justice. And I think people wanted more than ever to know that they were being treated fairly. And actually, the reasons they were coming to us, maybe you had a quibble about £50 on your bill. Some people 2 years ago might have gone, well, that's not worth my hassle going to the Ombudsman. Actually, that might mean a lot more to people now with all the other pressures, financial pressures. I think people are more willing than ever to fight for what they believe is right.
Great, thank you. Let's open it up now. So if you could say who you are, where you're from, and your question. Please wait for the microphone to come round, not because we're in a super large room, just because people who are in the Maldives can hear us. So let's start with Devon here.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Devon. I'm the Director of Policy and Practice. We wrote the report on how much benefits and other support goes unclaimed each year. So we identified £19 billion worth of unclaimed support. And just picking up on Daisy's point, I guess there is this set of data that exists within the public sector that can be used precisely to identify and target support. Are you finding the same barriers to utilising it as we are, which is just a lack of, fear, kind of the culture around data sharing being far too conservative, perhaps, as being the main blocker to it? And just to also point out, we do work with local authorities to use that data to get support to people, so it'd be lovely to follow up with some of you afterwards.
I'm going to take a round of questions, so thank you for that one, Devon. So let's go to Chris here.
Yeah, thank you. Chris Bowes, Head of Policy for Nationwide, so working in one of those sectors that perhaps doesn't have the highest levels of trust. I would make a distinction, and I think people have a low level of trust in a sector in banking, and they probably have a low level of trust in corporate HQs. But when you ask them, do you trust your branch or your branch manager, the level is very high. We've taken a slightly different approach to banks in terms of branch closures, and I do think just having a physical presence and someone to speak to makes a huge difference. The other factor which I think is undermining trust, certainly in financial services, and I think probably in other sectors as well, which we haven't touched on, is the level of fraud that we have. And we talked about trying to encourage people into the digital sector. I think where you can lose your money relatively easily and you have such endemic levels of fraud, unless we reverse that, we are, I think, sort of creating something which will undermine trust and will be very hard to tackle.
Great. You sound a bit like Steve Hilton when he was talking about humanising government and bureaucracies and, yeah. Anyway, I don't know if that's an insult or not. You don't want to sound like him now. Anyway, this chap here.
Isn't one of the problems that the system in the UK, it's neither fish nor fowl? I mean, Deng Xiaoping said, I don't care if the cat's yellow or black as long as it catches mice, and it's not working for anybody. And other countries do it better, US, Finland, France. So you have a lot of people, like these people sitting around here, taking an economic rent from providing something which is very, very basic, something which is easy to do, which the state was doing beforehand, but they didn't have money to invest. Why don't they just go either nationalize it or really privatize it? But it's not working. Just like the NHS, that's failing as well.
Great. Okay. So no
Market
more
model
halfway
doesn't-
house. And I'll let the panelists answer those questions. And sorry, without sounding rude.
DJ from Wickham.
Great. Thank you. So perhaps I can ask Guy to come first.
Great. So does privatisation work? So, well, all I would say is, there were enormous savings made out when the CGB was privatised, which all went to consumers. It's the characteristics of energy. It's got some monopoly elements. There's no point having two national grids. That would be a disaster for consumers, even if it was competition. So there are monopoly characteristics in part of it, and there's places which are open to competition in other parts of it, in the retail end and in the generation end, etc. And the difficulty is how you join all of those systems. So you need both markets and planning. That's inevitable in energy. And would it make any difference whether the parts with monopoly characteristics were nationalised or not nationalised? I think the evidence is pretty weak that it would make much difference. It's all about how well those bits are regulated. So I would challenge on that. And also I would say, getting the innovation, this back to this innovation point that you need to transform the economy into a low carbon economy that actually works for consumers. I would be I get excited about all the brilliant entrepreneurs, and I mentioned a couple of them that I talked about that we work with. Would they be as excited and brave about the opportunity if the best they could do is sell it into a monopolised energy company? I don't think that's the case, right? They are motivated by coming up with better solutions for consumers, but they're also motivated by profits, etc.
Great. Luke.
Oh, do you want me to answer all of them, or
just one of them? If you can, please.
So, oh god,
your favourite
my
question.
favourite one. Well, I suppose Vijay pointed out the NHS, and you part stolen my thunder because I agree. It depends how it's all boxed together. I think what we really want to see is, I love to use an analogy. So if we're talking about football at the moment, there's a big issue of how VAR is used. When is it in play? Over Tottenham over Liverpool, they made a mistake. What does that look like? Those are the rules. You can have a fight about what the rules are, but it's how they're interpreted and the fairness of the play within it. The same with the NHS, the same with energy. It's how it's segmented. Is it enforced in the way in which it's transparent and people understand it? So, for example, if you came to me as a doctor and I referred you on to a hospital, do you really care if it's a private hospital or an NHS hospital if the outcome is fantastic? So for you, it does. For many other people, it doesn't. And this is the difference. You've got the individual at the end versus the entire system that you're trying to build, which leads us on to the fraud stuff. We had it in furlough. I was pillared time and time again, being a Conservative MP, being told we're not going fast enough with getting furlough money out. We're not doing it fast enough. And every single time the Chancellor would stand up and say, we're worried about fraud risk, we're worried about fraud risk, we're worried about fraud risk. Now, every time I go into the chamber, I'm told we gave out too much money too easily with no easy checks. This is the reality we live in. It's the same with the energy. Taking up your point about Dizzy, the one bit you missed about it is incredibly complex. How do we segment it? But having been the PPS in the department, is those individuals, because actually park homes, canal boats, these tiny things that matters hugely to those people, 100,000 people, 500,000 people, they're the end users. So you have to take a policy basis. How can you catch the most people as quickly as possible? But then take it down to the individual at the end. So I'm much more keen on getting the outcome right rather than the system. But that's for me to think, and this town to think how we get that system right. But for people to understand it, because they don't understand, and understanding breeds that discontent and distrust. So how do we make that more transparent? The Ombudsman is there, but again, there are so many different regulators out there. That's part of the problem, because you have this with your phone bill, your TV company, your energy company, where you go for your car. That is a problem as a consumer, and somehow we have to support them.
Great. I like how you smoothly got two questions in there. It was very, very good. Laura.
In many ways, you're right to ask the question, what does the system look like today? The point is that, as Guy said quite rightly, we've delivered a lot of benefit. but the benefit was delivered about 10, 15 years ago, right? And the regime was designed 30 years ago. Can I just ask you, is there any retail or consumer proposition that looks the same 30 years ago? Now, this is about lack of, in some ways, courage of both the regulator and policymakers to actually look at that consumer experience, to understand what a consumer wants from its energy, water, or I would love my home services company, where I don't have to buy any of these dreadful utilities, but it's 30 years old. So we need absolutely fundamental retail reform. And at the moment, the energy sector divides 60 million people into 6 archetypes, right? So there are about, in this room, 6 archetypes, right? Amazon divides us into 150,000 different archetypes. The food sector knows somebody is pregnant before they know it themselves. This sector has no insight into consumers in the same way as other sectors. And while I would say, my God, they have not necessarily been at the forefront of customer service or innovation, picking up on Daisy's point, the regulation has sort of infantilized them. And they are only allowed to deliver you an electron at this price, in this way, with this billing mechanism. I actually want to be able to decarbonize my environment by taking a financial service product off the back of my heat pump because I can't afford to write out that check. I'd like some energy efficiency all packaged in. Then I want some of Guy's innovators to help me understand exactly how my bill is being reduced and it being automated, right? These are the sorts of things that I want, all of it with my broadband package. So there are ways of doing this. The broadband model is actually quite an interesting one where you could create what you might call a nationalized, the sort of BT open reach type bit, which is a highly regulated price for the essential service, for the absolute basic. And then, as you've got in broadband, lots of exciting propositions. So you decouple the social part, which has to deliver for vulnerable people, and the super exciting commercial part, because we're asking these companies to look both ways, and we're tying their hands behind their back too.
Great, thank you. Lots of people have taken this question on. So Ed, perhaps I could ask you, perhaps on Chris's question, the first point around sort of humanising the service. I don't know if there's anything you can say about that.
Yeah, I think it's something we try to do at the Ombudsman. So we now talk to every single person who comes to use our service, and we felt that building those relationships is incredibly important. And I think the same applies for suppliers in a way that contact and consumer contact was seen as bad in the past. It was a cost. Actually, now it needs to be seen as an opportunity, and whether you do that through local branches or talking to people, whatever you choose to do, you need the skills to do it. And I think it's for suppliers to think about how they get those skills, which are particularly important now post-COVID, I think.
Melissa?
I just wanted to speak to your point from Nationwide about trust in. You were saying that people do have a high level of trust with the people in their branches. And there was 2 things I wanted to say. One was a point that Think Strategy raised when I was talking to them. They were saying that actually people... There's different kind of reviews of how much people trust their banks, but he was saying people really do have faith in their banks to look after their money, and a lot of that comes from perhaps they really don't want to not trust that because it would be quite problematic if they did. But also a lot of people's interactions with their banks is doing things like putting their fingerprint on their banking app, and that you have this quite constant reassurance that there are quite a lot of measures in place. And I don't know, I was quite interested in what you were saying, because that was a conversation about the tech behind things, and you were talking about in person, and one of the big things with banks at the moment is there are a lot of branch closures, and there are far fewer people giving that in-person service, and I think that is probably a real touch point for all sectors actually as to how to maintain trust when you're making that transition from an in-person service to a digital service, or combining the two, and you know, and then also incorporating things like AI, because speaking to chatbots is awful. And I wonder if that is going to be the really big conversation in customer service going forwards, which is the kind of face of consumer or the bridge with consumer trust, is navigating that shift from in-person to digital.
Great, thank you. And Devon asked a question, but he's left. Hopefully he hasn't stormed out because we haven't answered it and complained to the think tank ombudsman. Oh, right, you were going to... Right, okay.
No, I worry. Does anyone else care about the digital spine and data sharing?
Yes.
So yes, the answer to this, we did a big report. Gosh, it's been a year, hasn't it? Earlier this year, with the Social Market Foundation for Citizens Advice, looking at energy bill support. And we did look in some detail about how on earth you create the data sharing architecture to do this. And it turns out most of it exists. Great news, it's all there. The legal cutout that allows government to share that data exists and has been tested. There is precedent. The government already takes energy billing addresses from energy companies, and it gives the energy companies basically give that data to DWP, and DWP tags them and sends them back to the energy companies, who then administer warm homes discount. So that bit exists. The bit that doesn't exist is the government understanding people as households rather than individuals. So what would need to happen, and I think you could come up with, I think, a quick and dirty version of it, and this comes back to your point about how far do you get. This matters a lot to individuals, but how far could you get quite quickly by looking at where people's addresses are. So the big problem with this would be getting everyone to tell their employer where they currently live, because how many of you work PAYE and have never updated your address with your employer? Most of you, I would argue. I did a quick poll of our office, and particularly all the young people said, I literally can't remember which address I registered with our payslips. But if you gave employers a year's notice, I reckon you could get them to ask employees to update their addresses on their PAYE records. It's part of what employers have to share every month with the government, is your address. It's in the mandated PAYE data set that has to be sent across. So you could get HMRC to pull that all together into one. You could put that together with our understanding of benefits, and you could probably come up with a fairly good database pretty quickly. But if you ask the civil servants at what is now DESNES, then they say, did you see how long it's taken them to do universal credit, and it's not finished yet? So all the bits are there. We just...
Yeah, and also HMRC is notoriously not particularly open in data sharing.
Well, given everything that we said, I just wondered if you think there's a private market opportunity here, because I've sorted out my mobile phone, I'm opening a new bank account, sorting out my car. It's the bane of your life, Lifemin. Actually, someone being able to put that into ability to alert you to all these different things and choices actually seems like a very good opportunity. Now, the data procurement bill is, the data volume 2 bill is coming forward to allow more open source data to be able to deal with these kind of things. Do you think there's an opportunity for the market to solve the problem? Because if we wait for government to do it, there's always a danger that actually you might be waiting a very, very long time.
I am persuaded by that argument. I think, though, in this case, the problem that we are absolutely trying to solve is getting away from private companies providing welfare services, which I think is at the core of some of the erosion of trust we've seen, because there's a confusion there about whose interest it's in. So I think for this one thing, but my hope would be if you could create a functional digital spine, the government would then have a much safer way of sharing data to allow private services to then... So you could give access to private companies to a sort of validated version of your data and understanding of you or your household, and that then allows for some of the services that Laura's talking about. Although I think if someone from Octopus was on this panel, they'd say, we do this stuff already, despite the government sometimes, but we do it.
Final point from you.
No, I was just going to say, I totally agree with you, and we have this debate again, if I hark back to the Health Select Committee when I was on that looking at data. The problem is you get the counterfactual of British public are very sceptical sometimes about sharing their data, what it looks like. They're quite happy to walk around with a phone that tells them everywhere and their friends where they're going, but when it comes to these kind of important data, when the government has tried to do that for research and things like that, there's a massive pushback with hundreds of thousands of people withdrawing their consent to be able to do so. So it's, again, they've got to trust the politicians in the first place that they're doing it for the right reasons to help people, as opposed to see it as some Chinese type light event where you're suddenly going to be tracked. Yeah, quite happy to check in on Facebook. So.
Agreed. But I think if you told them that's how they get their furlough or they get their warm homes discount, I think that might go a long way to helping change minds on that. Though, to Chris's point, it's a lot quicker to lose trust than it is to build it.
Absolutely.
Great. So it hasn't completely finished because we've listened to our customers and they've said that they want some networking time after fringe events. So we've included that as an innovative new thing. So please do stay around and talk to speakers and to other attendees one-on-one. We've got the room for 15 minutes to facilitate that. So please do stay around if you'd like to do that. Just to say that if you're interested in energy, our next event at 2 p.m. is with KPMG, and I suppose we're going much wider in consumer market, and we're thinking about the future of energy as we transition to net zero and the supply of energy and the mix. So please stick around for that. We've got Andrew Berry, MP, who's the Minister for Nuclear and Networks. And if you're interested in Bright Blue, please speak to any of the people at the back about becoming a member and supporting our work. But thank you very much to all of you for coming today. Thank you to all of those on the live stream. And thank you to Energy Ombudsman for partnering with us on this event. And please, a big round of applause for all of our speakers.
Thank you. Right.
Second.